All right, I think we're good to go. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and happy Earth Day. My name is Chris Abinasif, and I am the director of the Lebanon program here at the Middle East Institute, as well as the moderator for today's panel discussion. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to today's event, Against All Odds, an Ambitious Climate Policy for Lebanon. This event is part of a week of programming to highlight the expanse of impact and challenges that climate change has had and will continue to have in the Middle East in the years ahead. Lebanon has faced multiple crises over the past year and has been challenged as a nation on political, economic, and humanitarian fronts. However, amid all of these challenges, Lebanon has brought the importance of its climate ambitions to the forefront. Included in a 10-year plan of action, the country has revised both its GHG emission targets and renewable energy-sourced power generation targets upwards. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce an exceptional panel of experts to discuss the issues and the opportunities linked to climate and to investigate how Lebanon is responding and can respond in the future to this important challenge. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Sylvia Kreshim-Beni. Sylvia is a policy officer for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf at the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action. Next, very happy to welcome Jessica Abed. Jessica is an independent energy policy consultant and a non-resident fellow here at MEI's Lebanon program. And then finally, we have Vahaken Kabakian. Vahaken is a climate change advisor and portfolio manager at the United Nations Development Program based in Beirut. To submit your questions, please feel free to use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can probably find at the bottom of your screen. And then for those of you calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream on YouTube, please feel free to ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And throughout the panel, if you have any technical difficulties, also please feel free to email panel events@mei.edu, and our team will be monitoring that inbox. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. Sylvia, Jessica, Vahaken, and I will be looking at all of your questions, and we will try to factor in as many as possible into our conversation. And with that, I think we're ready to go and start our conversation today. So Jessica, let me turn it over to you first to get us started with a simple question, but I think there's more to it than it being a simple question. And that is, why are we really having a conversation on climate today and not in a few years once Lebanon sorts out all of its economic, political, humanitarian crises? So why a conversation on climate today? Obviously, it's MEI's Climate Week and Earth Day and all of that, but why are we tackling these conversations at this timing when the country is going through so much?
Well, Chris, I'm sure a lot of the attendees and participants as well are asking this question. So I want to flag three key points on this: the investment opportunity, the economic cost of climate change if we do not actually tackle it in Lebanon, and the cost of the energy sector. So first, if we look into the investment opportunity, Lebanon needs so much investments right now and can tap into several funds, especially after the pandemic. So if we look into how the money is flowing, we see that investors are looking into more sustainable long-term investments, especially after they've lived the volatility of the oil industry and the dip in oil prices last year. Donors and international organizations also have climate targets, and this week we're seeing so much ramp up in climate target. So the investment opportunity is there for Lebanon to tap into all these various investments. Two, the economic cost of climate change. Climate change is not going to wait for us or for anyone to sort all the problems out. Sadly, the economic cost of that is going to be huge on Lebanon and on productive activities in terms of water scarcity, drought, floods, soil degradation. So that's going to impact our entire economic sector, and we cannot afford additional economic costs. And third, if we look into the energy sector, first, it's the highest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Lebanon. And two, it also has a huge cost on the state budget, on citizens, and on businesses. So if we want to have an economy that's actually thriving, we have to have affordable electricity. And the opportunity to have affordable electricity is also through low carbon technologies and renewable energy, which would also reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think it will be useful to dig into, each of these buckets in a second as well. But before we do that, let me also turn it to you, Vahakin. I know you've been incredibly engaged and involved in the NDC, the nationally contributed, the nationally, wait, I missed that out.
Determined contribution.
But yeah, so the nationally determined contributions of Lebanon, and that was effectively issued last March, a few weeks ago. So I was wondering if you can also walk us through it a bit, and just walk us through the significance of this revision upwards that happened compared to what happened 5 years ago. So what is the vision? What are the targets effectively? And in summary, really, what is this telling us about the prospects of climate policy in Lebanon in the years ahead?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for NI for having me on this panel. I think one of the most important numbers, which is not there when you read the NDC that has been submitted, is the level of ambition in terms of emission reduction. Practically from 2015 version to the 2020 version to the 2021 version, there's an additional 25% of emission reduction commitment that was put on the table. Very much so based on the various sectors that contribute to the economic activities. Primarily, as Jessica has mentioned, the power sector, so electricity sector, and specifically, other than the switch from heavy fuel oil to natural gas, so there's a substantive contribution to that target from that specific action. The targets for renewable have been ramped up. So now we're looking at 18 to 30% renewable electricity, specifically, and again, renewable heat production in the building sector only, which wasn't, specified in the 2015 version. So in a way, there's a more clarity, more clear vision in terms of what that entails compared to what it was in 2015. That brought us to the having a higher emission targets. Lebanon's target is very much a deviation from business as usual, which means in what it could be in 2030. So we're reducing from what it might be, our emissions, by 20 to 31%. Obviously, the lower end is the unconditional targets, so something that is primarily based on repayable and national efforts, while the conditional is much more on grant-based activities primarily. Why? Well, one, because it's entrenched in the legislation. So once you ratify the Paris agreements, you sort of need to abide by that. So that's point one. Point two, also, we're looking at, the work started pre-COVID, right? So, but we were also looking at this building better green post-blast as well, and trying to make sure that what will come ahead would be in a greener and much more climate-oriented, so much more climate-centric specifically. So those were like the broad, if you want, drivers why that sort of work has been done, and the NDC was tabled to the international community.
Thanks, Vahakin. And I think we'll also dig deeper into that component as well. And then speaking of international community, I think that's the perfect way to deflect this to you, Sylvia, as well. Given your work as part of the European Commission's climate action team, curious as well about your thoughts and your views and your plans. First of all, at an EU level, of course, briefly, but more importantly, how this relates to what you refer as the neighborhood. So effectively, the close countries, the proximate countries to European countries, mainly in the Mediterranean, but particularly in our case for Lebanon. So curious to also hear your thoughts on both of these.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm pretty glad to have this conversation these days, in particular on Lebanon, where the impact of COVID-19 and climate change are set to make an already difficult economic environment even more precarious. But against all odds, and I really like the choice of the title because I think it's particularly appropriate, Lebanon is the second country in the MENA region that submitted a revised and more ambitious NDC under the Paris Agreement. No other country in the region, except the United Arab Emirates have done that. So I think that for us, this is certainly an important step and a good base for an engagement along the lines of our European Green Deal. Let me give you a brief snapshot of where we come from, both domestically and in our external action, and see how this relates to our work in Lebanon. So when we first presented the European Green Deal, probably that was end of 2019, of course, nobody would have anticipated the sheer magnitude of the COVID pandemic and how it would affect all our lives for the years to come. One of the crucial lessons that we should learn from the COVID crisis is that prevention is by far superior to any cure that can ever be. So over the next years, the countries around the globe approximately will spend about $10 trillion in measures targeting the recovery from the pandemic. So you'll understand that choices and investments that we make today will shape our future for decades. So we better take the right ones. So this is why Europe has chosen the Green Deal as the blueprint for economic recovery in our engagement with partners around the globe. So why are we doing that? Why are we investing in green now? And why this is important for Lebanon? Because we believe that making the recovery from the pandemic as the solution for the climate crisis is actually a smart move, not only from the environment point of view, environment and climate angle, but also from an economic and security perspective. So let's talk, Jessica briefly mentioned before about losses. Let's talk about losses. Let's look at losses a little more in detail. Look at Europe, and you will see that Europe every year suffers about 20 billion euros in losses from climate-related extremes. 9 billion only in droughts when a particular year are tough. In Lebanon, there are studies that show that if current temperature trends continue, the GDP could suffer contraction from between 3 and 32% in the few decades, suggesting that pretty much the average cost per household would likely exceed the average annual earning. So what instead of just looking was what's happening, we take action now. And why should this action go in the green direction? If you look at the IMF estimates, you will see that the green recovery plans have by far a greater potential to create new jobs than the old brown models. According to the IMF, more or less every $1 million spent on traditional infrastructure can create between 2 to 8 jobs. But if you look at research development, green electricity, efficient buildings, and all the green recovery measures, we're talking about a potential of between 5 and 14 new jobs, pretty much. Take also adaptation, for example. Adaptation means the response to the impact of climate crisis and the impact of climate change. So if you increase the climate resilience, you have a triple dividend. You will help avoid future human, natural, material losses, clearly. You will help generate economic benefits by reducing risks, increasing productivity, and stimulating innovation. And it will bring environmental and cultural benefits. Honestly, I really believe that we all have now a once-in-a-generation opportunity to embrace a green transition and build back and forward better, to quote the UN Secretary General a few months ago. So Europe is and has always been one of the strongest proponents and champions of climate action. Over the years, we have been capable to demonstrate that decoupling emissions from economic growth is possible. Since the 90s, we have decreased our emission of about 24% and increased our GDP of 61%. But now we want to do more. And the European Green Deal is our answer. Just a few words to mention what we have been doing now and how that will be translated in our engagement with Lebanon and the neighborhood. So the Green Deal for us is a modern growth strategy. It encompasses everything. It's a 360-degree engagement, from mobility, the way how we build the environment, we build our infrastructure, the energy production, consumption, agriculture, everything, trade and financial taxonomy. We pledged to become climate neutral by 2050. And last December, we committed to a new 2030 target for greenhouse gases emission of at least 55% as compared to 1990s. In the last month, we started translating these goals into new policies and new engagement in Europe and abroad. So just yesterday, the European leaders agreed on the first climate law enshrining the 2050 climate neutrality target into a binding legislation. And we have committed approximately 30% of $2 trillion of the EU budget for the next 7 years for climate action. And 100% of our budget should do no significant harm. I think this is an important measure that will be reflected also in our external action, external assistance. Another important element of our climate engagement, also with partner countries, is a new vision for adaptation that we have just adopted, because it will help minimize the vulnerability and the impact of climate change also in our partner countries. So the Green Deal is a growth strategy for Europe, but is also an international engagement blueprint for the EU, and one of the key pillars in our cooperation with Lebanon. Very briefly, we really believe that we have an opportunity to build back better in Lebanon. We share with Lebanon the objective of promoting stability and prosperity, and the recovery from COVID pandemic is an opportunity to fast track the green transition, promote inclusive growth and jobs. So considering, when I think we'll talk about that later on, but considering the environmental and climate stressors to which Lebanon is exposed, it is clear that the green growth path out of the crisis is more important than ever. People have been feeling the pressure from having no clean water, no clean air, no energy security. The energy emissions, so the greenhouse gases emission coming from energy, are expected to increase even more. But we have found in Lebanon a constructive partner on climate action, and indeed the recent commitments done in the new NDC submitted at the UNFCCC are clearly witnessing that, and we are very pleased with the effort done by Lebanon. We are working in Lebanon since a long while, and over the past years, we have mobilized over 2.4 billion in development assistance in a number of sectors, among which also the green transition. The NDC for us will be certainly a blueprint to guide our cooperation, our engagement, and we will be there to help Lebanon increase its climate ambition and implement and achieve its commitments. We have been traditionally working on mitigation measures, so energy efficiency, renewables, under different instruments. I can elaborate on that after if needed. But in particular, we have been working also on solid waste management, green and circular economy. And we have very interesting and very positive experiences in working with municipalities at local level and in fostering innovation. We have a very, very active community of switchers, which is a community of green and circular entrepreneurs that implement innovative solutions across the Mediterranean and in Lebanon. And in this community, Lebanese innovative entrepreneurs have managed to find a space for business incubation and acceleration, peer-to-peer support, and access to crowdfunding and finance. They've really done a very good job. And again, here, I think we will elaborate on that after, but is again another example of the numerous opportunities that Lebanon has, a lot of capacity, a lot of innovation, a dynamic startup scene. But we need certainly sustained commitment, finance, and support from all the sides of the international community, the domestic scene, and the civil society. So for the future, we will continue working on that, and we will reinforce our work on adaptation, of course, on the risk prevention and management, in particular on agriculture, water, and coastal zones. And we will increase our commitments on climate finance to make investments and innovation possible. I will leave it here for now. I already speak too much. Sorry, that's my limit.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and you raised a lot of points, and thank you for the people in the Q&A as well for raising some great questions that we're going to have time today to get to. Before we do that, Vahakan, I want to build on the points that Sylvia has raised about it being an ambitious policy and having potentially the ambition and the resources, and the desire, the manpower, etc., needed to potentially work on that and make it happen. Now, that being said, I was wondering that in the absence of the mind space for the Lebanese leadership, very often they're dealing with other problems, or climate, unfortunately, doesn't fall on top of their priority list. When you think ahead for the years ahead, effectively, what do you see as the low-hanging fruits? What do you see as efforts that could be done, policy that can be written and implemented, and investments that could be guaranteed potentially to really push the climate policy agenda forward? So what is easier on a relative basis to do very, very soon? And how would you approach that as well?
Thanks, Chris. I think that's exactly what I wanted to follow up on, specifically on after Sylvia's intervention. Yeah, I mean, the trick is to speak their language, right? And in your last sentence, you just said investments. So what we've done is, other than the NDC document itself, there are three, if you want, macro development plans for Lebanon that has been devised across the last two governments or so, 2019, 2020. So the SAD, which is quite famous in Lebanon. So it's the Capital Investment Program back in 2018, or the Paris Pledge, nothing to do with the Paris Agreement. The Lebanon Economic Vision, so that was a Minister of Economy-driven work that looks at how the entire economy should change going forward. And lately, the financial recovery after the monetary, financial, fiscal, banking crisis. I might have missed one of the crises there, but the entire fiscal issue that we're facing, and monetary and foreign exchange issues. So what we've done is we've put all these together, and each one has a different set of projects, ideas, investments that were brought forward by the governments, by the various institutions. And this is the angle that we took. We said, let's climate proof these. So out of 400 plus projects, we've analyzed around 100 which were relevant, that could be climate proofed. And we've actually did a cost benefit analysis, do nothing versus do climate smart investments on the exactly same investment that's being proposed. So obviously, other than generating the fact that would generate, again, additional jobs, creating more employment, and so on and so forth. One point to retain is that every dollar invested as a climate proofing would bring in additional $3.2 in savings over a 20-year period. So that's a quite important message that needs to go across the platform in Lebanon, but also outside Lebanon, when whoever is trying to approach to support Lebanon in such things. So very much around $2 billion, $1.72 billion investment in terms of climate proofing. The benefits are somewhere around $5.56 billion. Obviously, that's in socioeconomic benefit, right? It's not only dollar to dollar in terms of pure investments. But interestingly enough as well, and if eventually reforms are implemented at a larger scale and we're moving ahead with those plans, practically climate proofing the climate investment program of the country, the Lebanon Economic Vision, and the Financial Recovery Plan would bring additional emission reductions that are tabled in the NDC currently. And that's something quite interesting. So we just looked at, other than, from a pure climate angle, this is an NDC, Paris Agreement, and so on and so forth. So yeah, in a way, we went and we thought of really pointing out or speaking their language, moving away from climate commitments and so on and so forth. Yeah, and that's where we are at currently. We will be devising further steps in how to take things forward that are Also policy issues outlined in the NDC itself, what needs to be done from a fiscal perspective, from a governance perspective, from transparency perspective, and we will try, at least in the short term, hoping like, to not lose time, by the time we're out from this crisis, to start working on those specific issues so that eventually, everything is ready and then deployment, goes ahead as fast as possible. Because there's not much time in for 2030 is for Lebanon, 2030 is like 2 years time frame for other countries.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Vahakin. And to turn it to you also, Jessica, along the same lines, but maybe adopting a more sectoral approach. I know you pay a lot of attention to the power sector, to the water sector, but also a lot of other sectors such as potentially transportation or food are also really on the table when it comes to the investments, but also the attention when it comes to climate proofing and climate investments and all of that kind of bucketing of things. So what do you see when you're looking at the future of these sectors? Power, I know, and electricity has always been notorious in Lebanon for both pollution, but also from a fiscal perspective for all the draining that happens there. So how do you see that particular sector evolving, especially that there's a lot of reform talk, and it has been a lot of the times at the center of the reform talk, be it electricity itself, power, but also water increasingly. So what are your thoughts on that when looking at Lebanon's climate ambition in the future?
Well, to link it to fiscal point and the economic impact as well, as you mentioned, Lebanon cannot have a power sector policy that just gets implemented now, and when we get to 2030 and the world is entirely changing, we can consider what happens to renewable energy. At any point in time, Lebanon actually needs a policy that focuses on achieving energy security, on reducing the reliance on fossil fuel, which we entirely import, and actually provides the least cost electricity provision. So when we look into all the three factors, we see that what we can rely on, what we have to rely on, is actually our domestic natural resource, which is so far renewable energy. It's cost competitive, it's green, it would improve the status of businesses. So we need to have these as core pillars for any policy moving forward. And now when we got to the point where we have all this economic and financial crises, and we have a shortage in dollars necessary to import fuel, we find that renewable energy can actually keep the lights on, if I can say. And also we're going to get to the point where we have to remove subsidies, right? So the state cannot afford to keep subsidizing electricity, but a huge part of the cost of electricity is that we generate very expensive electricity. So also to reduce that cost, we need to rely on renewable energy. When we look into businesses, when the subsidy is going to be hiked, and also now even with the subsidy, they rely heavily on expensive polluting diesel generators. So switching to renewable energy or to hybrid renewable diesel model would actually achieve a huge savings for all businesses, for consumers, for industrial sector and the commercial sector, agriculture, and so. So if we're going to have to be competitive in the future, if we're going to export more, and if we just want to keep up with how the world is going, we have to rely more on renewable energy. So this is the only way forward, and any policy now needs to take this into consideration. We cannot get into a 8 years period and realize that we didn't invest in this. And also Lebanon has a huge opportunity now in the power sector, portrayed in the fact that we actually do not have a functioning power sector. We need investments into the grid and power generation. And if we look into the experience of developing countries, they normally face bottlenecks in renewable energy because at some point they need grid investments, and they have so much thermal generation capacity that serves as a barrier to integration of renewable energy. But Lebanon does not have these barriers now. So we're going to have to invest into the grid, and we have to factor in renewable energy. So we'd actually save into grid expansion in the future. We don't have enough. We have a shortage in generation capacity, so we have to account, and we can base our plans on the integration of renewable energy. So Lebanon now has a huge opportunity on leapfrogging this.
Thanks, Jessica. And when you were talking, I was seeing Sylvia do a lot of nodding as well. So let me turn it back to you, Sylvia. What Vahakin and Jessica have said sounds the most in line, at least, with your vision, or like the EU's vision, at least when it comes to climate action? And where do you see really the areas of collaboration going forward, be it EU-Lebanon, EU neighborhood, but also, potentially US-Lebanon or US-EU, et cetera? So in the broader scheme of things, but particularly in the case of Lebanon, really going forward, where do you see that climate diplomacy or the role of partnerships evolving effectively?
No, indeed, I was nodding because I was recognizing basically all the areas that we have identified, that we have been pitching also for a greener and more sustainable engagement with our partner countries. So, but looking at low-hanging fruits, because it's clearly needed to reboot quickly the economy after a crisis, there are several. And certainly I agree that investments in renewable energy are an important step to start with, and I will go back to that in a minute. I just wanted to highlight another thing that is important. Together with low-hanging fruits, we need, and quick fixes, we need to have longer term engagement and policies for sure. And I liked here the reference to fiscal measures and governance, because that's what's gonna set the trend that, is needed to implement credible transition. Credible transition, which is essential also to send signal for the private sector. If we want to attract investments, we need to give certain signals to the investors, to the private sector, of stability, of credibility of the reforms that we want to undertake, because otherwise they will not invest in a transition that is expensive and can be risky if it's not sustained over time. That's at least also one of the main pillars that we have in our Green Deal, and to give a certainty of a long-term commitment. For us, it's a lifetime commitment. So I think the element of fiscal policies is particularly important, because you need to start budgeting for transition on the one end, and another element of that that we have introduced with our adaptation strategy, you need also to start budgeting the costs of the impact of climate change, because that is an element to be prepared. So that's one aspect. The aspect of governance is essential, so that there will be the need to work on, I would say, comprehensive policies that go from energy transition to industry and production, growth, management of natural resources, transport. All this needs to be factored in when looking at sustained climate action. I think the NDC is already giving a very important indication of the policy direction to take. And certainly from our side, as I said before, that will be the blueprint for engagement in helping Lebanon and our partner countries engaging seriously in this transition. Now, in terms of opportunity, what do we see as interesting avenues for investments and cooperation in Lebanon, not only for us, but I think for all those who want to seriously help the country grasp the opportunity of growing back better. I would say there are pretty much 4 sectors, macro sectors that we could look at. One certainly is energy, renewable energy, and the clean energy transition. Jessica already elaborated on that. I will not spend a lot of time. I just wanted to quote a study from the International Renewable Energy Agency, studied the potential of Lebanon to generate renewable. They estimated that Lebanon has the capacity to generate the target of 30% of its electricity from renewable resources. And they also estimate that if this target is achieved, there could be a potential for annual saving of up to $250 million, more or less, which is still quite good, in addition to, of course, meeting the electricity demand and support growth. So Jessica already elaborated on that, on the need to invest in the grid. Certainly that's important, grid infrastructure, but I also would mention the small scale applications. These are particularly important also in remote areas, in vulnerable communities at local level. They really make a difference. We have very successful examples in Lebanon, but also in other countries. Imagine that small scale applications are one of the few ways in other countries, in countries in conflict like Yemen, to secure a certain access to electricity, which is essential. So the second, and then another point on energy that I forgot to mention is energy efficiency. So it's not only investing in renewable, but really grasping the potential of investing in energy efficiency, in particular in buildings, but not only. The second pillar, in my views, for action, investments, and engagement is adaptation. Lebanon and the Mediterranean are one of the most vulnerable hotspots to the impact of climate change. So you combine it with the economic crisis triggered by the pandemic and the previous vulnerability, you will understand that, I mean, the risks are certainly increasing exponentially. This also has impacts on security, on displacement, and so on. There are a number of solutions for that, on which it is important to start investing now. There are solutions for climate smart land management, sustainable cost management, for example. And for what concerns our action, adaptation will be one of the main pillars of our engagement, because we find that it's essential to help our countries, to our partner countries, increase their resilience and help unlock financial resources for climate adaptation. This is quite important. And on this regard, and also for what concerns the mitigation pillar, an important partner will be development banks and financial institutions and the private sector, and with whom we are already working, and we want to intensify our work. And this is also linked to the third area that we see as a potential, and that's also mentioned by Haken, on job creation economy, and the potential that the green and blue economy can offer for growth and jobs, in particular for the youth. And we all understand that it is crucial and vital for a young population of Lebanon, of the region, to grasp this opportunity and be able to foster an inclusive and sustainable growth. The fourth element that we see quite interesting and important for action is the protection of natural resources, for protection and valorization of natural resources. Because this, in addition to have, of course, important environmental and climate implication, it can also help create jobs and growth, especially through sustainable tourism, agriculture, and aquaculture, for example. If you take, for example, the tourism sector, one of the main impacts of the COVID pandemic has been a dramatic change in the travel patterns, which will remain. The tourism sector will certainly, with time, inshallah, reboot its activities, but rethinking tourism pattern for countries in the Mediterranean, in particular for Lebanon, to remain competitive in the global scenario is a necessity. Sustainable tourism is an interesting way to secure significant employment opportunities and help offset the negative impact of the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic. There are a lot of interesting experience and example in Lebanon in sustainable tourism. Also nature-based solution. They have the potential to drive innovation in tourism, resulting in better management of resources. And yes, I think one final think that is crucial is investing in environmental awareness and education, and engage all stakeholders to assure that the green transition is successful. And as one of the most famous climate activists used to say, all big changes in society have been started by people at the grassroots level. And this is, I think, where we need to join forces. We need to work at all levels to advocate for the right policies, to demand the right reforms, demand that they are implemented, and demand that the right investments are done. And again, here as well, Lebanon has a potential. There is the Lebanon Climate Act that is a good practice because it's a robust platform for stakeholder engagement, but there are other avenues also to work. So you asked me a little about climate diplomacy and climate action from the international community. Well, I think all our activities should go in this direction, supporting the green transition, supporting the country build back better, and really boosting green recovery policies and the efforts that Lebanon has been doing with its updated NDC. We have our ideas, our views is a positive proposition. We are proposing a cleaner air, cleaner water, lower energy bills, a proposition for a more resilient and inclusive economy for all. Lebanon has an incredible amount of assets, and I think really that the transition towards sustainability in the wake of COVID and the economic and political emergency is more important now than ever.
Thank you, Silva. Very expansive, but I think very useful on these four fronts that you've talked about. And let me get back to you, Vahaken, or Jessica, whoever wants, or maybe both of you, for like one of the tougher questions I think that was raised also in the chat. It's on this matter of, we talk a lot about the ambition, we have a vision for it, and then there is always debate and thoughts about the actual implementation of it, especially when it comes to, who will be investing effectively in Lebanon. Plainly put, I think one of the questions in the chat is asking, who would invest a single dollar, be it institutional or private investors, knowing that effectively the country is in crisis financially, economically, and no policies have been really taken to protect investors there, especially energy investors. So why do you think, and that's kind of your bread and butter, I think, Vahaken and Jessica, working on the investments front, but also on policy fronts every day. Why would investors really invest here when they have much better opportunities elsewhere? And what can really Lebanon offer them that other countries do not necessarily do?
All right, so I guess I'll go first. There's definitely not a substitute to actually having reforms and to actual financial and political solution for Lebanon. But normally crisis can trigger reform. So if we look at it, at some point, the state cannot afford not reforming anymore. We sadly we have seen a no action policy so far in Lebanon, more than a year into since Lebanon has defaulted on its debt. But things cannot go on like this forever. At least nobody can afford it, not the state, not the citizens. There definitely needs to be a financial solution. And but we're also, the purpose of policy is also not to look into things just on the short term, but also to figure things on the long term. And so this is why we need to actually have a vision and to commit to it on the long term, and to have policy tools, adequate policy tools to change things moving forward. So we know, at least in the power sector, that we're going to have to remove subsidies at some point in time. The state has to do it because it cannot afford it. And as Sylvia has mentioned, there's a huge opportunity for small-scale distributed renewable energy. And if we look into the situation now in Lebanon, we see that businesses and consumers who cannot afford it and others are going forward with renewable energy because it's the way to go. They want to maintain electricity, and they want to they want to reduce their costs. For the investors' perspective, as I said before, we look into things for the long term. We want to make sure that the policies are in place so that when we do have a financial solution, we can attract investments. We do need regulations, of course, for renewable energy, and we do need ASAP the parliament to pass a distributed renewable energy law for Lebanon that would provide incentives for investors, but also for consumers and businesses to switch into that. We do need to reduce bureaucracy and provide one-stop shop for all the licenses, and to improve the entire regulatory and also procurement frameworks. So a lot of people are working on a lot of these things. We're not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow, but as Sylvia also has mentioned, change starts with on the grassroots level, and we're all working together for this.
Thanks, Jessica. Vahakan, up to you, maybe same question. And let me also add to it one that came by email from one of our audiences that has to do with education, asking, whether you've worked, because that's something you've directly, I think, contributed to it, So the education front, particularly for youth as part of the NDC or within Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, effectively in the Action for Climate Empowerment. So maybe your thoughts on the question on how do you move forward? How do you implement this? What's the governance like? How do you make sure that investors are there? And also maybe if you can touch upon the education front, that would be very useful as well. Thanks.
Let me start with the education and get that out of the discussion points. Back in so we're talking about very much under the climate sphere. So in 2015, we did develop this teachers guide based on the Lebanese curriculum. So from grade 1 to 12 on how to incorporate climate education into whatever material they're actually teaching in class. It's Lebanon, as I was saying, 10 years is like, it could happen in a year or two in somewhere else. It has been picked up after a certain lag time very recently. So there's work, being done now to reassess that teachers' guides with the support of UNESCO, so with the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, to actually explore the possibility to push that into the curriculum on an official basis. So that's where we are specifically at that item, agenda and the. I feel like I'm in the negotiations, but yeah, that's where we are at that specific item. Going back to the main question, obviously, and it's quite obvious that there's a colossal work that needs to be done, specifically on the reform parts. It's a difficult question to answer when you ask who would come and invest in Lebanon these days, but also, thinking sometimes of the opportunities that Lebanon still, has for investors. Put aside the financial issue. So the market is there. If everything done properly from a governance perspective, and I think just outlined all the points, and I don't need to go back there. One by one, it all depends how fast that would happen. It all depends on how transparently that would take place, and setting a transparent system in place. But also, I think Sylvia had when she was mentioning the 4 points, I think it was a sub point when she mentioned the development banks and the private sector. There's a specific role that we see that development banks, be they multilateral but also bilateral, could play in sustaining what we have currently, and deploy a tiny bit more, very much at the decentralized level as much as possible. I mean, one of the concerns we have is the loss of the sector. I mean, over the past 10 years or so, the renewable technology deployment sector, those companies that actually install PVs at a small scale, solar water heaters, and so on and so forth, might not be able to continue surviving the crisis. Those are very much imported materials. So there's a specific role in there. But then I think the question that I was reading in the chat was very much related also on the political front. Whether in the Q&A, whether with such a political situation or gridlock, other than the private sector, is the multilateral banks, EU, bilateral countries are ready to support, specifically Lebanon in this. And I think that's. I mean, we would like to hear a clear answer in general from our partners all around, because that would also help us shape what we're planning in the short term. There are ways of doing things in the short term, which could only be based on grants or support, minimal survival sort of mode. But it could also go on a decentralized, non-government processes involvement sort of way that could, as much as possible, deploy even on a modular basis, more and more decentralized technologies at the municipal level, for example. It's a very much based on what's on the table. We know from our end what we have to offer, and we also are aware very much on what are the constraints that we're facing.
Thank you, Bahakin. I hope that answered at least part of the question, two questions that are coming from the audience. Jessica, maybe can I also shield one to you, since again, you work in oil and gas and energy, broadly speaking, and this is a good question on national security potentially and oil and gas resources. So is Lebanon's development of its offshore gas resources sensible as a response to climate change, or is it ill-advised from this perspective? So kind of, this intersection between oil and gas potential extraction and climate, and how it contrasts potentially to this renewable energy component that you've mentioned a bit earlier today. So what are your thoughts on that part?
So it is a fossil fuel industry. So I focus on the greener side of the industry. So my perspective for this industry are actually a bit negative, but also if we look into the time frame for Lebanon. So at the point we're having this chat, Lebanon doesn't have any actual, any discoveries of any economically recoverable wells, gas. So at the point we're having this discussion, if tomorrow as Lebanon was to actually find anything, then we're not going to start producing before 2030. So it's not something that we're looking into having in the short term, but also even then, so it can help in terms of ensuring domestic energy security, of enhancing energy security, because Lebanon would still need some thermal generation capacity, of course, and switching to gas from heavy fuel oil and diesel oil is necessary. And gas is considered as the transition fuel until we actually move into a carbon neutral world in 2050. But the prospects of this happening is not going to happen anytime soon. There are so many challenges facing this industry. Sadly, politics are one. And if we look into how much of huge potential it can have, it's actually minimal in terms of infrastructure, transport. So mostly it would be used domestically. It would sustain some of the needs we have, and it would enhance energy security by reducing reliance on imports. We still need that, but then again, it's not something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Thanks, Jessica. That clarifies it. And before I move to the closing round of remarks for a minute or so, Bahakin, I just wanted to also ask you, since you're effectively, sitting in Beirut, leading up these climate effort agenda for the country for the next decade, effectively, what would be in one or two points, effectively, the most urgent needs or pressing needs that when you're engaging with the international community, potentially with the Europeans, with the Americans, with the Gulf, and then when, within the framework of the climate agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, in one or two sentences, effectively, or one and two asks, how can people sitting out there, right, in policy-making decisions at the development banks or in other potential decision-making capacity positions, what would be the most effective and most useful engagement of the international community to help Lebanon propel and push this ambitious climate agenda that it has?
Very tricky question, but I remember once we had a colleague from EU visiting Lebanon to develop a certain framework project, I think regional one, and he said off the records, what would entail, what would be that you would expect from from the international community and EU or otherwise, and I said, don't give us money. Don't give us funds. That's not what we're looking for. Stop capacity building. Stop technical assistance. Come install the wind farms, and just give the key to us and say if you want to provide support, just come and install it and just say, all you need to do is push the on button. Now, obviously, that's highly, I would say, well, it's not really something that might happen, nor in Lebanon or probably anywhere else. But it's, I think, very much important to use the climate lens in any support or any discussions that are taking place at the bilateral and multilateral level. So that would practically support, in a way, the bottom-up work that's being done when it comes from the ambassadors or the presidents or the prime ministers meeting Lebanon, having discussions on expected reforms, having discussions on the various, future of Lebanon in a way. Putting that on the agenda would be one of the most important things that we want to see.
Clear. Thanks, Vahaken. And unfortunately, we have 3 minutes left. So let me just go to each one of you in 30 seconds, if so. I'd like to close with this question on what are you really looking ahead for in the next weeks or months, or in our case, probably years? So what is the one thing that your eyes are on, that you're paying attention to, or that you're waiting or expecting to happen in the next few weeks or months from a Lebanon climate lens as well? What are you focusing on? Let me maybe start with you, Sylvia, in 30 seconds or so. What are you paying attention to particularly?
Thank you. Quite challenging in terms of question and time. Now, what I would see, what I would like to see happening, action and accountability. That I think, especially the last one, is particularly important, and it deals also with the implementation of reforms, with investing, with creating an enabling environment for investments, and delivering on the demands of the citizens. That goes for climate action, environment, and beyond.
Thanks, Sylvia. Jessica, maybe over to you.
I want to reinstate that crisis can lead to reforms, but it's our duty to make sure that these reforms are efficient, and we need more evidence-based policy that relies and informed decision-making and informed citizens. So we want to also ensure that citizens are part of any consultation in any way moving forward.
Clear. Thanks, Jessica. And Vahaken, you have the last word on that.
Can I just say all of the above? Well, definitely I agree with those points made, but very much so from our perspective, having climate change mainstreamed in all discussions taking place at the national level, withholding what has been said so far, by Sylvia and by Jessica's final comments.
Perfect. Thank you, Vahaken. And thank you for taking the time, Sylvia, Jessica, and Vahaken, obviously, to be with us. And thank you for the audiences for joining. Unfortunately, our time is up, to be mindful of everyone's time. This recording will be up on the MEI website shortly. We've had another panel yesterday on the state of human rights and recommendations to really stop the slide that is also online. Please feel free to check it out.